We're back at Unbound Radio. This is TruthStreamMedia Live with Melissa Melton and Aaron Dykes. And earlier, I had mentioned the Delaney Clause. We're going to transition into talking more about our food and the food tyranny that we have going on in this country, because we're working on a mini documentary right now. We would hope to have it done this weekend, but every time we think we've found everything about it that there is to say, it just gets bigger and bigger. Might not even be able to call it mini anymore eventually. So that will probably have to wait till next weekend. But I want to read the Delaney Clause really quick for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It was a 1958 amendment to the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which said, quote, "The Secretary of the Food and Drug Administration shall not approve for use in food any chemical additive found to induce cancer in man or after tests found to induce cancer in animals." And it was applied to pesticides in processed foods, but only when the concentration of a residue of the cancer-causing pesticide increased during processing. And as chemistry got better and they were able to analyze things more powerfully and detect smaller and smaller quantities, they were able to realize that a lot of the stuff they were putting in the food was bad and could cause cancer. And so they had a difficult time administering this clause anymore because there were so many things in our food that were causing cancer. Now, our current Deputy Commissioner of Foods at the FDA, Michael Taylor, our food safety czar who's worked for Monsanto multiple times, in 1988, while he was working at the private practice King and Spalding law firm who had Monsanto as a client, while he was there, he published an article titled "The De Minimis Interpretation of the Delaney Clause, Legal and Policy Rationale," which was delivered during the midst of a whole debate on the use of the Delaney Clause, which on its face says they can't be putting carcinogenic agents in our food. But he said that we need to interpret it in a de minimis way, that if it's a small amount, then it should be allowed on the market. So a small amount of cancer in your food, that's all right. And Taylor was totally criticized for it, considering the fact that they've attributed the stance not to a good faith effort to reasonably regulate or any of that kind of stuff, but basically a desire to help benefit Monsanto financially. Not that a lawyer would ever do that, right?
Well, because who is Michael Taylor? He's the quintessential revolving door figure who is a long-term lawyer for Monsanto, then in the USDA, then back with Monsanto, eventually vice president, then back to either the FDA or the USDA. Both. He was in both. And then back to Monsanto. Now he's the food safety czar under Obama. And he always seems to come
in under these certain times. Like, he came in to the FDA to fill a newly created post of Deputy Commissioner for Policy just at the time when he signed the Federal Register stating that milk from cows treated with the growth hormones didn't have to be labeled. Then he disappears again, but then he comes back. It's like, really, he just happens to come back at a wonderful time where he can say that if food additives are gross,
that's generally recognized as safe, and this gives this whole new illusion to where, is the food really safe? Is it really being regulated by the FDA, the USDA? What about the EPA? Well, it's actually not really being regulated if the food has been generally recognized as safe, and that goes for genetically modified foods as well.
And they determine that. The company that makes that food determines that.
And if they categorize a certain type of food as generally recognized as safe, if they won't even conduct studies to see if indeed there's any difference in the traits of genetically...
They just have to write it on a piece of paper. We think this is generally recognized as safe.
Even though these foods...
The FDA goes, oh, look, right here on this paper it says they recognize that it's safe. It must be. Okay, rubber stamp.
But these foods look like food, but they're producing their own pesticide inside of there. It kills bugs and it explodes their stomachs.
It blows up a bug's stomach, but it's okay for you because your stomach has magical properties that make it magically disappear from it. It totally doesn't bioaccumulate or any of that. Come on, that's silly. Why would you think that?
Yeah, and that brings up the work of Jeffrey Smith, who's a hero in my book. He does the Institute for Responsible Technology. He's highlighted at least 65 dangers of GMO foods, and one of the main areas is how it disrupts the digestive tract, how it junks it out and contributes toward this leaky syndrome.
Stops you from being able to take nutrients into your body, and when that happens, everything else, all the dominoes start to fall.
TruthStream Media. I'm your co-host, Aaron Dykes. Melissa Melton's here with me. And I don't want your counterfeit money. I don't want your counterfeit system. But it is what we have. Now, we've been doing in-depth research inadvertently on the USDA. That's the Department of Agriculture. That's the Secretary of Agriculture's domain. Right now, it's Tom Vilsack, who's a very interesting figure, who is also the governor of Iowa. He's been...
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Biotech Governor of the Year, guys. That's our USDA guy.
The head of our Department of Agriculture is de facto the biggest lobbyist among many for genetically modified foods.
He was actually a lobbyist. Like, he actually literally was.
He really was a lobbyist, yeah, and he continues to be one. And there's a huge lobbying organization called the Biotech Industry Organization, BIO for short, and they send literally hundreds of lobbyists to Washington. They wine and dine officials. I couldn't tell you for sure if any payoffs happen, but, you know, lightning does strike, sometimes even twice. And you've got the whole basic political mechanism bought out. And the result of that is that we have transferred millions and, yes, billions of dollars from hardworking Americans who pay their taxes to subsidize agriculture in general. And from that, you get this phenomenon where a hamburger is cheaper than making a salad. We're basically producing wholesome, healthy foods becomes outproduced by these factory farm initiatives because they're being subsidized through your money if you're paying taxes, directed through the government, through the Department of Agriculture, and billions of dollars go to create this whole artificial food chain where they raise corn to feed it to livestock so that they can efficiently create cuts of meat. And it's sickening to the animals. The conditions they're kept under are really completely analogous to a concentration camp. So our food's on a concentration camp already. And then they introduce the genetically modified organisms. Now our livestock are eating genetically engineered alfalfa. They're eating a lot of genetically engineered corn when probably most of those animals shouldn't be eating much, if any, corn at all. Instead, they get a diet.
They know it's killing the animals to eat that diet.
They know it's killing these animals to eat a diet based around it.
Which means inadvertently they know it's killing us. It's not a surprise to them.
It shouldn't be a surprise. And so all this is the backdrop to how they've got to this level of having generally recognized as safe. Well, it looks like corn to me, and corn isn't known to make people spontaneously combust. I guess the genetically modified corn is probably about the same thing.
Yeah, it looks the same. I think they should change GRAS to GIOS, General Illusion of Safety.
It is an illusion of safety, and we were talking on the other break about the Delaney Clause, which forbids known carcinogens, that is, components, chemicals, what have you, that are known to cause cancer in people from being added to the foods. But instead, because it's so widespread and such a fact of modern life in the factory foods, the produced foods that we eat, that they've created de minimis interpretations and other loopholes for companies in general, every company, for nearly every product you're eating to include known cancer-causing foods. This is carried over into foreign policy and world trade agreements because of the many countries, including the EU, where they have banned GMO ingredients. They're now circumventing that through world trade with what is known as a low-level presence agreement, which allows for a point whatever presence of GMO foods because essentially all the food is tainted. Then we have this issue.
Oh, yeah, we were talking about the recombinant growth hormone that's given to cows. In Ohio, they actually had a ban on labeling their dairy products in that state as being RBGH-free or RBST-free or artificial hormone-free. They weren't even allowed to put that on their products at all. It was a ban. But then in 2010, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that Ohio's ban on these things violated the dairy processors' First Amendment rights and was more extensive than necessary to serve the state's interest in preventing consumer deception. And they said that RBST-treated milk is compositionally different. All this time, we see it everywhere. It's on milk all over the place, that it's not. There's no difference between cows treated with these hormones and cows not treated with these hormones in the milk that you get, which, come on, I mean, common sense should tell you that's BS right on its face. But the court actually found 3 reasons how this is different. that number one, it increases the levels of hormone IGF-1, that a period of milk with lower nutritional quality during each lactation, and an increased somatic cell count, which means more pus in the milk of cows with that, treated with that. And the court further noted that higher somatic cell counts indicate the milk is poor quality and will turn sour more quickly. So all those little labels that say there's no difference, it's like, why would they even bother to tell you that there's no difference? They won't tell you there's GMO in your food, but they're going to tell you there's no difference. Come on. I mean, everything they do that has to do with labeling this country is done to benefit these mega conglomerate big
and to create loopholes that you can drive, factory trucks filled with cancer patients through. And you've got Michael Taylor again, who's now in charge of food safety in this country through the FDA. He wrote major papers at the institutes, including the Rockefeller-funded Foundation-funded institute he was part of, about food safety modernization. When he was in office during the Obama years, they've now passed the Food Safety Modernization Act that he was one of the framers of, and he was one of the original legal and Monsanto-tapped resources who fought against the ability for a milk company or grocer, etc., to put their own voluntary label on food saying this milk is RBST free. They tried to block that altogether from allowing them to label the fact that their product did not contain Monsanto's recombinant bovine somatropin growth hormone.
Right. Well, was it Massachusetts that they sued over that?
They've sued states over it. There's been a whole legal battle. The documentary, The Corporation, recounts the fact that the Fox-owned station Channel 13 in Tampa, Florida, did a big investigative report about the role of Monsanto in the bovine growth hormone product Posilac and all the different health risks that were posed by this stuff. And Monsanto played a role in having that report blocked. They scrubbed it from existence, and they've really tried to prevent people from even knowing whether or not milk has RBST. But when that legal battle was lost, when you do see at the grocery store labels that say this milk doesn't have RBST, they require them, though, through pressure on the FDA, to put the label saying, however, no substantial difference. We can't see any particular difference between having a genetically modified hormone or not. Yeah. But they've now found that's not true in court cases as well, right? That there is a difference?
Well, in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in Ohio, they did find that, and they found it in 3 different ways. But it still isn't changing it in here, for example, in the grocery store. You still see that here. So it was quietly found, I guess. So I didn't hear about it until just recently when I was doing this research. So it's not like they're making a big national announcement about it, but yeah.
But we've been investigating for really the past month and a half, off and on with all the other work that we do and just the daily things that go on. We've been researching the case of Contagion. It was a big mystery, right? Because they were on the cutting edge of biopharmaceuticals. They were growing AIDS vaccines, hepatitis B vaccines, trypsin, industrial adhesives, and different components for pharmaceuticals, as well as actual edible vaccines on corn, in food, grown side by side with our food crops. And there was a tainting scandal that was big enough to make headlines, but essentially no one ever knew what happened to that company or to the general movement for biotech pharmaceuticals in general. And so we've been investigating, and it's shocking what we found. It is shocking because everywhere you turn, the supposed regulators at the USDA, their particular division of APHIS, which is supposed to focus on the safety of these genetically modified
Animal and Plant
crops.
Health Inspection Service.
Yeah, that's supposed to be the inspectors, are always looking the other way and covering for these pharmaceutical companies. And Contagion in particular is nobody per se, other than all their principles come from the major biotech industries that you're familiar with, Monsanto being just one of them.
And they're continuing to be funded by our
But
government.
they continue to be funded by our government. They were funded from the start, from before their scandal. They were funded through NIH, which is National Institutes of Health grants. They were funded from USDA grants.
Small business grants.
They were funded from small business grants. They were given money from the state of Iowa and other states where they were growing. Other companies you'll find have National Science Foundation grants.
So you want me to give them a little hint, honey?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Contagion, a lot of people wondered what happened to them after they were growing AIDS virus and corn and all this stuff. what happened after they had all these contamination scandals? Well, during the last one, APHIS finally said, you, Protagene, and your successors and interests are never again allowed to apply for regulation permits or notifications to introduce any more genetically engineered organisms anywhere. You cannot do it. But what they don't say here is that during that exact same period, during that same year, one of the founders of that company was busy setting up another company. He was getting federal assistance through the USDA for small business grants for that company so that he could continue doing exactly the same thing that company was doing. And the whole time, there's the USDA giving him money to set it up. There's the NIH continually funding it throughout the years since.
And so you find that while the left hand says, oh, don't do that, we have to regulate the food safety, maybe you're not being so safe there, they don't stop the actual work that's being done. And while the left hand says, regulate, we're watching you, the right hand shovels more money in the face of these scientific researchers to these big chemical companies that bought out all meaningful regulation and who essentially rule the de facto practices of our modern life and the things that the vast majority of us eat. If there's never a bigger reason to start a victory garden movement to oppose these companies, I can't think of it.
Well, what's so twisted about it, too, is that they're saying, well, we need more regulation because of this case, because this case happened. Well, first of all, they gave him a slap on the wrist, and what I mean by that is they gave him a $250,000 fine for the first big contamination that happened in 2 states, Nebraska and Iowa, and then said they were making him pay for the cleanup. But then they gave him a no-interest loan, a $3.5 million loan, and then they gave him a year to pay that back. Does that really sound, would they do that to you if you did something wrong?
No, there'd be big interest
Just
points.
Rain money down on you.
Huge penalties
no
if
interest,
I didn't pay.
Don't have to pay it back. And we don't even know if they ever did actually pay any of that back. Then they said, we need to get more regulation going on here. Definitely. So what we're going to do is we're going to revamp our regulation. And I found a memo that in doing that, they went to this company and asked their principals for what their opinion was on what they should do to rewrite the regulation. So they went to the company that couldn't even keep their crap straight when the regulations weren't that in depth, and said, what can we do to make our regulations better, company that doesn't follow our regulations that we already have in place?
Did we or did we not find evidence that we're going to show in our documentary that the very people creating these biopharmaceutical crops, as pharmaceuticals grown in corn, were writing their own regulatory structures and handing them to our supposed regulators?
That's what's going on here. And in the meantime, we've got the USDA and the NIH just pouring out money. Yes, here's some more money. Please go do it. Just change the name and go somewhere else and do that. That'll be fine. That's totally fine.
When we get back, I want to just hint at what I don't have time to rant about, which is the other side of the coin. For more than 7 years, I've studied eugenics and been just horrified at all the things that have been done in the name of controlling the population, of leveling the population, and through that is the control of food, the development of genetically modified agriculture, even the green revolutions. And one family has been involved in all that for sure, among many families that are generally involved, and that's the Rockefeller-Funded. They have funded family planning, eugenics, depopulation, genetically modified foods, pushed them on the third world, which they want to rein in the most. Now, we've been told that genetically modified foods offer the promise of feeding the world. That's their whole mandate. While we have to fund and back and subsidize and roll out genetically modified foods and let no one stand in the way for it's going to feed the world. But should we feed the world? Should we feed these 8 billion people when they're just going to reproduce like cockroaches and just create more and more problems, especially in that awful developing world?
Oh, yes. Well, we came across this clip, and we were pretty well horrified, so we're going to play it for you, so you can be horrified and share that horror with us. This is a clip of Dr. Charles Arnson from the University of Arizona. He's the father of edible vaccines. He's the guy that invented that technology, and he's currently being funded by our Department of Defense to create the military's Ebola vaccine, and they ask him, should we be feeding this population? Should we be feeding 8 billion people? Or should we basically call the population? That's what they ask him at this table panel discussion with what looks to be a bunch of college students.
And his edible vaccine was funded by the Rockefeller-funded. Here's his response to their population question. In just a second here, let me cue it up. And
put them together. Considering the negative social and environmental impacts of human population growth, shouldn't we try to restrict food supply and return our population to a more sustainable level? On that same note, should there be 8 billion people in this world? Is there a limit on the number of people our planet can sustain? How do we go about this politely? Should we invade Mars? Newt wants to go to the moon, so don't forget that. And should we concern ourselves with feeding 8+ billion in the first place, or should we allow natural forces of carrying capacity to affect or limit population growth, placing our emotions aside? That's that question. So, thoughts on this?
Has anybody seen Contagion? Yeah, that's the answer. Go out and use genetic engineering to create a better virus. I mean, 25% of the world population is supposed to go in Contagion.
Science doesn't tell us read the methods.
Oh, that's
right. So the sound is kind of low because it's taken from a video, but basically they ask him, should we even feed 8 billion people? What should we do? And Arntzen, sitting on this panel, says, have you seen the movie Contagion? Well, that's what you got to do. And he raises his fist in the air in almost a revolutionary way and says, that's what you got to do. You got to go out and create a better virus. We'll genetically engineer a better virus. And then he makes another side joke to say that didn't they kill off 25% of the population in Contagion? And then later he says it was an absurd question.
So this was never even meant for the public, but once it's uncovered, people argue it's just a joke, lighten up. Yeah, we're supposed to be real comfortable with the scientists involved in genetically modifying pharmaceutical edible vaccines, and that when you eat a banana, it carries a vaccine in it. When they joke about culling the population and raising the question, should we even feed 8 billion? And then everywhere we look where there are actual cases of contamination of genetically modified crops, inadvertent, on purpose, whatever.
This is up on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TruthStreamMedia, but I just want to say straight away, people who said this was just a joke, and he said, oh, that's an absurd question, after he gave his little answer, this is the least funny joke of all time, okay? We have politically correct pundits and politicians in this country jumping all over people for saying way less than this. Think of the most racist joke possible that you can ever even think of. And it doesn't even come close to touching this guy's idea of a joke about murdering 25% of everybody, okay? And who has the means to do so. People get Secret Service sent to their house for telling jokes that are way less incendiary than this joke about a GE virus to kill 2 billion people. I mean, and it's one thing, by the way, to even make this completely non-funny whatsoever joke, but it's another thing to be the guy who's receiving Department of Defense funding to make an Ebola virus and who spent his whole career putting vaccines, and spent his whole career putting vaccines into food like bananas and potatoes and what have you. I mean, that's that guy, and he's making that joke? Really?
Now, we're not trying to say he's creating Ebola virus. I mean, that was a slip.
Vaccine.
But they use the virus to create the vaccines. They're attenuated.
They use part of the virus.
But what's the effect? If you're a country and you could stockpile an Ebola vaccine, does that make you more or less hesitant to use Ebola or something else as a weapon? As many documents have described governments considering doing, it's considered a reality of the future that will be established and in place as an understood point by 2025. NASA acknowledged it. We discussed that document last week.
Yeah. I don't know. Watching this, it horrified me that this is this guy's idea of a joke. And he's meanwhile playing with Department of Defense funding with Ebola vaccines, and which he is using Ebola virus to make.
And they're
he's like,
GMO.
Just go out and make a new GE virus, just kill 25% of everyone. That's great. Oh, wait, I was just kidding.